It began, as so many modern crises do, with a microphone switching on. In a quiet studio far removed from palace walls, Prince Harry sat down for what was expected to be another carefully managed conversation. Instead, within minutes, the tone shifted. Listeners who tuned in expecting reflection heard something far more consequential, the sound of a narrative breaking apart in real time. Before we move on, click like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. It costs nothing. Just hit the red subscribe button for daily royal updates. For years, the public had been presented with a singular image. Harry and Meghan were framed as partners in reinvention, architects of a new life that blended royal legacy with California independence. Their departure from royal duties had been described as a strategic evolution, not an escape. Deals were signed. Foundations were launched. Interviews emphasized unity, purpose, and forward motion. The brand of the Sussexes was built on the promise that they were not retreating from history, but rewriting it. Yet in this podcast appearance, Harry's language carried a different weight. He spoke less about transformation and more about exhaustion, less about building and more about what had been lost. He described the past few years not as a triumphant reinvention, but as an experiment conducted under relentless scrutiny, one that demanded constant performance just to maintain equilibrium. The confidence that once defined their public messaging seemed replaced by something closer to disillusionment. Observers immediately noticed the shift. This was not the rhetoric of a couple moving in lockstep. It was the voice of someone reassessing the journey itself. Without assigning blame, Harry acknowledged how profoundly his world had changed, how distance from Britain had not created the simplicity he once imagined. Instead, it had introduced a different form of complexity, one shaped by contracts, expectations, and the pressure to remain perpetually relevant in a culture that quickly discards yesterday's narrative. Behind the scenes, analysts and commentators began re-examining the foundation of what had been called the Sussex model. It was an unprecedented hybrid, part monarchy, part celebrity enterprise, part philanthropic platform. The structure relied heavily on cohesion between its two central figures. If that cohesion weakened, the entire framework risked instability. Unlike traditional royal roles, which are supported by centuries of institutional continuity, this new model depended on personal alignment and shared vision. As discussion spread across media ecosystems on both sides of the Atlantic, the contrast in interpretation became striking. American outlets largely framed Harry's remarks as a personal reckoning, the candid reflections of a man navigating identity beyond inherited status. British commentary, by contrast, viewed the moment through the lens of institutional fracture, asking whether the departure that once seemed decisive had ever truly resolved the tensions it sought to escape. What emerged was not confirmation of a single dramatic event, but the unmistakable sense of divergence. Subtle differences in priorities, once invisible to the public, now appeared magnified. Meghan's trajectory was increasingly described as globally outward-facing, focused on influence beyond traditional royal structures. Harry's reflections suggested a pull in the opposite direction, toward familiarity, stability, and the grounding influence of his origins. This divergence did not announce itself with confrontation. It surfaced gradually, through tone, emphasis, and absence. Joint appearances became rarer. Messaging that once sounded synchronized began to feel individually tailored. The carefully balanced narrative of shared reinvention started to look less like a unified project and more like parallel paths unfolding under the same spotlight. In historical terms, royal crises have often been marked by spectacle, dramatic interviews, official decrees, unmistakable turning points. This moment was different. It was quieter, more ambiguous, yet no less consequential. The modern monarchy exists within a media environment that amplifies nuance into headline significance. A change in cadence can carry as much meaning as a declaration. By the time the podcast episode concluded, the immediate reaction was not shock, but recognition. Something fundamental had shifted, not only within a marriage, but within the broader experiment that had attempted to merge hereditary identity with self-fashioned autonomy. The question was no longer whether that experiment faced challenges. The question was whether its underlying premise had ever been sustainable. And as analysts, historians, and audiences began to reassess the past several years through this new lens, one realization became unavoidable. What once appeared to be a clean break from the past was, in reality, the beginning of a far more complicated negotiation between tradition and independence, one whose outcome was still unfolding, and whose consequences would extend far beyond the lives at its center. In the days that followed, the reaction did not arrive as a single wave, but as a slow, gathering tide. Commentators revisited timelines, comparing past statements with present realities, searching for the moment when confidence had begun to erode. What they found was not a dramatic rupture, but a series of incremental recalibrations. Contracts quietly concluded, public initiatives scaled back, and an increasingly noticeable absence of the sweeping announcements that had once defined the couple's post-royal strategy. The entertainment partnerships that were meant to anchor their independence became case studies in the volatility of celebrity-driven ventures. Streaming executives, once eager to align with royal adjacency, began to prioritize measurable returns over symbolic associations. Projects announced with cinematic ambition encountered the unglamorous mechanics of production schedules, audience analytics, and shareholder expectations. In that environment, prestige alone could not guarantee continuation. This shift altered public perception in subtle but significant ways. The Sussex narrative had originally been framed as liberation from constraint, a move toward creative and personal autonomy. Now, analysts began to describe it in the language of market adaptation. Freedom, it seemed, required infrastructure. Without the institutional scaffolding that had once supported every engagement, each endeavor had to justify itself commercially as well as culturally. At the same time, palace officials maintained a studied silence. There were no rebuttals, no visible attempts to reclaim the narrative. The monarchy's response was procedural rather than emotional, continuing its program of modernization, public engagements, and constitutional duty without reference to the transatlantic developments dominating headlines. That restraint was itself interpreted as strategy. By refusing to participate in the spectacle, the institution reinforced a contrast between continuity and volatility. Privately, however, those familiar with royal operations understood the complexity of the moment. The monarchy has always functioned as both family and framework, balancing personal relationships with constitutional symbolism. Harry's evolving public reflections therefore resonated beyond personal matters. They touched on enduring questions about belonging, responsibility, and whether departure from such a system can ever be absolute. Meanwhile, Meghan's focus appeared firmly directed toward sustaining relevance in an environment defined by rapid cycles of attention. Public appearances emphasized advocacy, leadership, and forward momentum, projecting determination even as media narratives grew more skeptical. To supporters, this demonstrated resilience. To critics, it suggested an unrelenting need to redefine the story before it could be defined externally. The divergence in tone between the two became increasingly difficult to ignore. Where Harry spoke of reconciliation with memory, Meghan emphasized reinvention. Where he referenced heritage, she highlighted possibility. Neither stance was inherently contradictory, yet together they created an impression of differing emotional geographies, one oriented toward reflection, the other toward projection. For historians of the monarchy, the episode underscored a modern paradox. The royal institution derives strength from permanence, yet the individuals within it are subject to the same pressures as any public figures navigating a media-saturated age. The Sussex experience illustrated what happens when those two dynamics separate entirely, leaving identity to be negotiated without the shared vocabulary that once unified it. As weeks turned into months, the initial drama faded, replaced by a quieter reassessment. The story was no longer about a sensational break or a triumphant reinvention. It had become an exploration of consequence, how decisions made in pursuit of autonomy reverberate over time, reshaping not only public roles but personal landscapes. And in that reassessment lay the deeper significance of the moment. The question was no longer who had been right or wrong in the choices that led here. It was whether any modern figure, royal or otherwise, could fully step outside a legacy so globally embedded without discovering that history, once carried, continues to speak long after the stage has changed. The longer the situation unfolded, the more it resembled not a single rupture but an extended aftershock. Public attention, once fixated on declarations and interviews, shifted toward observable outcomes. Analysts who had once debated motives now examined trajectories, where influence was consolidating, where it was dissipating, and how reputations evolved when separated from institutional context. For Harry, this period became one of visible recalibration. His appearances carried less of the urgency that had defined earlier chapters and more of a reflective cadence, as though the struggle had transitioned from confrontation to interpretation. Causes he championed remained consistent, yet the framing changed. Observers noted that he spoke increasingly about service rather than opposition, about continuity rather than escape. It suggested an awareness that identity built entirely in reaction is difficult to sustain. Within royal circles, the response remained deliberately understated. Engagements continued with practiced precision. Investitures, diplomatic receptions, charitable initiatives, each reinforcing the monarchy's central asset, predictability. Constitutional systems rely not on personality but on endurance, and by adhering to that rhythm, the institution projected stability without needing to address controversy directly. The contrast between spectacle and structure became its own form of messaging. Meghan, meanwhile, advanced a strategy rooted in authorship of narrative. Projects emphasized storytelling, curation, and the shaping of cultural conversations, signaling a desire to operate not adjacent to power, but within the creative economy that interprets it. Supporters framed this as evolution. Skeptics called it reinvention under pressure. Both perspectives acknowledged the same reality. Sustaining visibility outside a royal framework demands constant production, not merely presence. Media coverage gradually lost its earlier volatility. The language of scandal gave way to that of assessment. Commentators evaluated successes and missteps with a detached tone usually reserved for long-term case studies rather than breaking news. In doing so, they reframed the entire saga, from dramatic departure to a complex examination of how legacy institutions and modern celebrity intersect, collide, and occasionally misunderstand one another. Financial analysts joined the conversation, pointing out that independence carries operational demands once absorbed by the crown. Logistics, security, communications, and philanthropy all require funding models, governance structures, and measurable outcomes. The transition from symbolic capital to practical capital proved far more intricate than initial narratives suggested. Autonomy, while liberating, imposed its own discipline. Public opinion, predictably, fragmented. Some saw the journey as a cautionary tale about underestimating the gravitational pull of tradition. Others viewed it as an inevitable experiment in redefining relevance for a new era. What united both interpretations was recognition that the story's stakes had moved beyond personalities. It now reflected broader tensions between heritage and self-determination in a world where institutions are scrutinized as never before. Time, the monarchy's most reliable ally, began to soften the sharper edges of debate. Headlines that once carried urgency settled into retrospectives. The absence of new revelations allowed earlier claims to be weighed against lived reality, and reality is always less theatrical than expectation. In that quieter atmosphere, the narrative matured into something more ambiguous, but also more instructive. Ultimately, the episode illustrated that departure is never merely geographic. Leaving an institution so entwined with national identity does not erase association. It transforms it. Every subsequent endeavor becomes interpreted through that origin, whether embraced or resisted. For Harry and Meghan, the challenge was no longer to explain why they left, but to define what enduring purpose would replace what they had relinquished. And so the story closed not with resolution, but with redefinition. The monarchy endured, adapting through continuity. The couple persisted, navigating reinvention in real time. Between them remained an unspoken dialogue about duty, autonomy, and the cost of exchanging one for the other. A dialogue that, even as public attention drifted elsewhere, would continue shaping how this chapter of modern royal history is ultimately understood. In the weeks that followed, the intensity of the moment began to settle into something far more consequential than headlines. What had once felt like a confrontation now resembled a long negotiation with reality itself. The initial shock had passed, leaving behind questions not about who had been right, but about what any of it had truly achieved. Public fascination did not disappear, but it changed character. Curiosity replaced outrage. Analysis replaced spectacle. Harry found himself navigating a landscape without the clear boundaries he had known all his life. Inside the royal system, roles were defined before he ever stepped into them. Outside it, every decision required construction from the ground up. Appearances, partnerships, even charitable initiatives demanded layers of planning once handled invisibly by palace machinery. Independence, he discovered, was not the absence of structure but the responsibility of building one. There were moments of visible confidence, speeches delivered with conviction, projects launched with optimism. Yet there were also pauses, subtle but telling, where certainty seemed replaced by reflection. Commentators observed that his language had shifted again, less about grievance and more about legacy, less about what had been lost and more about what might still be built. Reinvention, it turned out, was not a single act but a continuous process. Meghan's path ran parallel but distinct. She leaned into creative and commercial ventures that emphasized authorship and control, spaces where narrative could be shaped rather than inherited. The strategy drew both admiration and skepticism, but it demonstrated a clear intention: to operate in arenas where influence was measured not by tradition, but by audience engagement and cultural relevance. The transition required constant visibility, an unending cycle of production that contrasted sharply with the ceremonial rhythm of royal life. Back in Britain, the monarchy responded in the only way it ever truly could, by continuing. Engagement followed engagement. Ceremony followed ceremony. The institution's message was delivered not through statements, but through persistence. Stability became its argument. By refusing to be drawn into prolonged reaction, it reinforced the perception that it existed on a timeline far longer than any individual conflict. As months passed, public discourse began to absorb a quieter understanding. The story was no longer about a dramatic exit or a decisive victory. It had become an illustration of two fundamentally different systems of meaning. One rooted in continuity, hierarchy, and inherited duty. The other grounded in personal agency, modern media, and the belief that identity can be reshaped at will. Neither system fully displaced the other. Instead, they coexisted in uneasy contrast. Financial realities, professional expectations, and shifting public attention imposed their own discipline. Without the gravitational pull of royal status, every initiative had to justify itself on its own merits. Successes were earned rather than assumed. Missteps carried sharper consequences. The couple's journey increasingly resembled that of entrepreneurs navigating reputation as both asset and liability. Time, as always, softened certainties. What once appeared as rupture began to look more like transition. Historians and analysts started to frame the episode not as rebellion or betrayal, but as a case study in how ancient institutions encounter a culture defined by immediacy and individualism. The clash had been inevitable, the outcome less decisive than anyone expected. In the end, no single moment marked the conclusion. There was no final declaration, no symbolic reconciliation, no dramatic reversal. Instead, there was adaptation. The monarchy endured by remaining what it had always been. Harry and Meghan endured by becoming something entirely different. The distance between those paths defined the legacy of the conflict far more than any argument ever could. And with that realization came a quieter truth. History rarely closes its chapters with certainty. More often, it leaves them open, allowing time to decide what they meant. In the end, what remained was not the noise of accusation or the spectacle of separation, but the quieter reality that follows any public storm. The arguments faded, the cameras moved on, and the world, restless as ever, found new stories to chase. What lingered was the transformation of three lives that could never return to what they once were. Harry's struggle became less about reclaiming a place within an institution and more about defining purpose beyond it. The titles, the ceremonies, and the inherited expectations had shaped him, but they no longer dictated his direction. Each step forward required intention rather than tradition, and that shift, though difficult, offered a different kind of freedom, one measured not in privilege but in accountability. Meghan, meanwhile, continued carving a path driven by reinvention. Her future depended not on acceptance from the past, but on her ability to command relevance in an ever-changing global stage. Whether praised or criticized, she operated within a world that rewards momentum, not memory. For the monarchy, the episode became another chapter in a centuries-long narrative of endurance. It did what it has always done: absorbed the shock, maintained its rhythm, and allowed time to dilute controversy into history. And so the story did not end with triumph or defeat. It settled into something more human, a reminder that legacy is not a fixed inheritance, but a negotiation between who we were, who we become, and how the world chooses to remember.